Hello and welcome. My name is Madeleine Longoria Garcia, and these are our other stories. Okay, here we are, the very first real full-length episode of season 1 of this podcast. Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining and listening. I'm excited to introduce this to you even further than what I shared in the first intro episode, and really just start to dig into what we're doing here, why I'm doing this, and share what we're going to be exploring in this first season. So I did mention previously, we are going to be looking at a specific theme in this first season. And when I was bringing this podcast together, brainstorming all of these ideas, trying to figure out what I wanted to bring to people, how I wanted to bring it to them, how I wanted to invite other voices into this space and allow them to share these other sides of them as well and their stories, I had originally mapped out kind of one sequence of events, one sequence of guests, and general themes for each of those guests. And then in the last 2 months, as I've seen and witnessed just the way things are progressing in the United States and really around the world, I couldn't ignore that. And I couldn't ignore that in my presentation of this podcast to the world. And so I've decided in the launching of this first season, we are going to be touching on the theme of migration. And we are going to be sharing stories of migration. Most of these are going to involve emigrating to the United States, but some of them are going to involve other places. And the goal is to bring you a diverse range of voices and stories where you hopefully will hear different perspectives, different threads of a family story, while also being able to connect those threads and realize there are so many commonalities that we all share. And that there are immigrants everywhere. It is not just in these major cities. It is not just the United States. Immigrants are everywhere. And the more I think about this, the conclusion I have come to is that migration is one of the most human things we can do. It has been a part of human history since the beginning of our existence. And the same is true for so many species in the world. I think it's really strange that we have lost touch with this human aspect of migration. One of the common threads that I've seen so far is no matter where people are moving to or from, for eons, for all of human history, people are doing this for the opportunity to seek out better opportunity somewhere else, to seek out more food somewhere else, safer conditions, better climate, all of these things. And because they are leaving a situation and circumstances that are no longer able to support them, that are no longer safe for them, that are no longer suitable for our human needs. And now we've gone and added a bunch of made-up lines, created a bunch of paperwork, made a whole business out of migration, truly, which is what it is. And I can go probably do a whole episode on just my thoughts on that in the world, but I'm not going to do that. The goal of today is for me to introduce this season with my family's own migration story. And I'm starting this with my dad's side of the family and sharing how my dad's side of the family came to the United States. So I guess let's just jump right in, right? Most of my family, actually all of my family on all sides, they are from Mexico. And my dad's side of the family is from the state of Tlaxcala, which is the smallest state of Mexico. Most people who are outside of Mexico do not know Tlaxcala. I will say most of the time when I say that to people who are unfamiliar with Mexico, have no idea what word I have just spoken. And it's a really fascinating place, though. And the more I learn about it, the more I kind of just laugh because I'm like, oh, that makes sense. It makes sense that I have ancestral roots to this place and these people, and that blood is running through my veins because there's just some interesting thing about the Tlaxcalans and that land and the people. And it's a cool place to kind of do some research on. So that's where my father's side of the family is from. They're from this tiny town outside of a town called Apizaco. And to give some family history and just background of them in that place, my great-great-grandfather, and this is really as far back as the family history or family knowledge goes on my dad's side of the family, my great-great-grandfather was a sheep herder. And he was nomadic to a certain extent and had ended up settling down and establishing a ranch in Tlaxcala. And then he helped my great-grandfather, whose name was Jose, start and establish his own ranch. So they had sheep, they had cows, they grew corn, they had chickens, and I should be saying this all in present tense because this ranch still exists. It is still in the family, it still operates, and they still have these animals and they still grow corn as the main crop. So that is kind of where the family lineage, the family story starts, is sheep herders establishing this ranch, having this ranch. And this is where my great-grandparents lived, outside of Apizaco in Tlaxcala. And my great-grandparents, Jose and Felipa, they had 12 children, which, I mean, back then, you have a ranch, you're in a rural area, you need labor, you have a lot of kids. So my grandfather was the eldest of the family, of the 12 kids. So he was born in 1920. And my great-grandmother, when people talk about her, the way that they describe her is that she fully embodied the word and beingness of matriarch. Like, she had this presence, she had so much respect, not just in the family, but in their entire community. People knew who she was, and she just was, this presence. And I remember that too. I met her a couple of times when I was very young. Once when she was in the United States. I actually don't remember that at all. And then once when we went to visit her in Mexico on her ranch. And I do remember a little bit of that. I remember holding her hand while we were walking around her ranch. And that's really the only part of that trip that I have any memory of, is just holding her hand. And she lived to be 99 years old. She was extremely healthy until the very end, when she became very sick. But yeah, she embodied matriarch. And I share this with you to kind of just set the tone of what my family was like, because I think a lot of people assume, oh, Mexico, I mean, today, even 100 years ago, super patriarchal, super machismo, all of this stuff. And yes, I do not deny that that is in existence, not just in Mexico, in so many places around the world. But in my family, people had this huge, immeasurable respect for my great-grandmother. And people don't speak the same way about my great-grandfather. I have to say that. People don't speak about him with the same feelings and evoking that same feeling toward him. So my grandfather was the firstborn, so he's the oldest. I don't know if this is true, but I kind of assume he spent the least amount of time in school compared to his siblings. I know that he stopped going to school quite young. I don't remember the exact age, but I think it was somewhere around 10 years old he stopped going to school. And he had to work on the ranch. He had to work on the land. He didn't really he worked on the land. He was a shoe shiner in the Zócalo in Apizaco, which Zócalo is like the town center or the city center in Mexico. That's the word that's used to describe that, the big main town square. And this is very common in every town and city I've been to in Mexico. There are shoe shiners everywhere. So he did that. I think he was in a mariachi band for a little bit. He was a barber at one point, kind of did a couple of random things. His mother, Felipa, encouraged him to do something different with his life, to not just stay on the ranch, to not just stay in the hometown, but to go seek out something more. And I think that's also something that's quite unique to her when we think about the other circumstances of being a rural family, a lot of kids needing to work the land. And interestingly, her husband, my great-grandfather, did not support that, did not want him to leave, but he left. So again, kind of just setting the tone of who was actually making the decisions in the family and doing the things. So in the 1940s, the United States entered into an agreement with Mexico called the Bracero Program. And this was a labor agreement. The United States needed more labor because of World War II and the post-World War II era. So many men had left to go fight in the war, and so many men had died in the war that there was this gap in the available workforce in the United States. So, of course, as the United States does, they look to Mexico for help in labor. And this agreement is created, the Bracero Program. And what this was basically a lottery system for men to come to the United States and work in agriculture and on the railroad. I believe those were the two main industries that were seeking employees. And there's some interesting details that I don't know all of the information on, but there was negotiation of work conditions, living conditions, what was covered, what kind of things the employers needed to have available for the workers coming from Mexico. And I believe it was the state of Texas, actually, that was excluded from this agreement. That Mexico said nobody could be going to that state because there had been a history and uptick in lynching and violent racist attacks on people in the state of Texas. And so Mexico said, you're not allowed to go, you're not allowed to send our people there. Which is interesting. So there was this whole thing created, and my grandfather and his next eldest brother decided to enter the loteria, the lottery, to try to come to the United States as a bracero. And so what they did is they went to Mexico City, which wasn't that far. It's not that far from my family's ranch. It's only a few hours away on a bus. So they went to Mexico City. The story goes They went to this big stadium. Everybody went to go receive like a card or a ticket of some sort that had a number or a color or something like that associated with it. And it was a lottery system. So they would just draw numbers or colors, whatever that paper had, at random to decide whether or not you were going to the United States. And whatever it was, one of them, either my grandfather or his brother, switched cards with another man because they wanted to be on the same train, literally. So either they were going to go together to the United States or they weren't going to the United States. So whether it was a color, they swapped cards to make sure they had the same color, or whatever the number sequence was, like they made sure they were in the same number group. And then they waited. And then the lottery happened, and their card, their number, their color, whatever it was drawn. And so they got on a train and went to the United States. And like I said, there were a couple of different industries that people could work in. It was either agriculture or on the railroad. And there are going to be so many times in my family's story where I can only explain things by saying they were so lucky. They were in the right place at the right time, met the right people under the right circumstances, and this is how everything came together to ultimately lead to my family being in the United States. So my family, or my grandfather and his brother, come to the United States, and they end up with the railroad, and they're working with the Southern Pacific Railroad. This is 1947. And they're not like physically working on the tracks on the railroad. They actually get placed in the central coast of California. Beautiful place. And they're working inside. They're not working outside. They're working inside the rotunda, or the roundhouse, which is where they are turning the trains around to go the opposite direction. And this is what my grandfather does for a year. And again, the story goes that his boss liked him. He got along well with his boss, and generally he had a good experience. I never asked him those questions, but this is what the family story is. So this was a 1-year contract. So from 1947 to 1948. And actually, I'll share a photo of this. I'm not sure exactly what platform I'll use yet, but I'm going to choose a platform where I can share a little bit more media and photos with you all, and for those who are subscribing. And I have this photo of my grandfather's ID when he was part of the Bracero program. So everybody who was part of this program got this whole ID. It has all of his information on there. And he also got a social security number that was specifically associating him with the Bracero program. And the way that he actually found this out, he didn't realize that that social security number specifically identified him as a bracero on the railroad with the Southern Pacific Railroad Company. He just thought it was a social security number. But he found out decades later when he and my father were working with an accountant to do their taxes, and the accountant, knowing nothing, like the first meeting that they had, was like, "Oh, you came over to the United States in the 40s through the Bracero program, huh? And you worked for the Southern Pacific Railroad Company." And my grandfather was just like, "Yeah, how do you know all of that?" And the accountant just said to him, "Well, your social security number, this specific set of numbers, whether it's like the beginning or the last part of it, I don't know, but it basically is this identifier of men who came over during the Bracero program and worked for the railroad." So super interesting. Anyway, I will share a photo of that. And another thing that when I see this photo, or when I see this ID of my grandfather, it's just so funny to me because it has all of his identifying information. And I'm just like, damn, I come from small people. He was a petite man. And anybody who knows me in real life, I am a small human and I know that. And like, holy shit, it literally is just my genes. Everybody's so fucking small. And that is the indigenous side of the family. That is the indigenous blood. My great grandmother was a very petite woman. She had so many indigenous features. The quote unquote tall men in the family were probably like 5'5" or 5'6", like not that tall, but they are known as like the tall men. So it's very funny to me, and yeah, I'm like, oh, these are my people. Yeah, great. So he does his year on the Southern Pacific Railroad in the Rotunda, has this boss who likes him. And his boss wants him to come back for a second year and renews the contract for a second year. And so there's a period of time, and I don't know exactly how much time goes by, but he goes back to Mexico. He marries my grandmother, and they actually eloped. So this is 1948. He's 28 at the time. My grandmother was probably 18, maybe 19 at the time, and they elope. And I'm sure there probably was some maybe like drama with the family after they told everybody that they got married. I'm not sure what that dynamic was. But then she comes to the United States with him for this second year. And I don't know the details of how, if like everybody was allowed to bring a spouse with them, if there was some exception that he was able to figure out. I don't really know the details of that. But I know that my grandmother then came with him for the second year in 1949. And my grandmother actually had received her diploma to become a professional seamstress in Mexico. And she never professionally worked as a seamstress in Mexico or the United States, but this is something that she did for friends and family. And like, she loved working with her hands. She loved crafts. She knitted. She did all of this like beadwork and really amazing things. So this is something that she did to make money as well, but never like in a professional capacity. So they're in the United States. My grandfather is working for the Southern Pacific Railroad. And in that second year of him working for the railroad, they meet these two folks from Europe. And they are European immigrants who had recently become US citizens. I don't know exactly where they were from in Europe. I believe it was northern, maybe Scandinavian nation. Not quite sure. But they end up befriending my grandparents. They're the owners of a small market or convenience store in the town on the Central California coast. And yeah, they become friends. And they end up helping my grandparents figure out how to become US citizens. And I don't know, again, all of the details of what it took and what was required for them to become US citizens back then. But this is the family story that they helped them study for the exams, so they knew all of the information that they would need to prepare for, to be asked these questions. They helped them figure out the documentation that they needed to have all in order and available and ready to go. And these two people are the people who helped my grandparents become US citizens. This is how the story goes. So they become US citizens. They have 3 kids, all born in the Central Coast of California. including my father, who is the youngest of the three, and they live out their lives. And a lot of the story that I have comes through the perspective of my father, because this is the person who I've had the opportunity to ask the most questions about this. And so he doesn't know some of the details, and there are some things that definitely happened before he was born, or things that happened when he was very young that he doesn't remember. But, I asked him, because in the 50s, the United States had this really terrible attack on the Mexican population in the US, whether or not they were US citizens, whether or not the border had crossed them. And I hate the name of this, but it was called Operation Wetback. And it was the forced removal of Mexicans, anybody with lineage to Mexico, back to Mexico. Again, regardless of their citizenship status in the United States. And this happened in the 50s, so not long after my grandparents had migrated to the United States and had become citizens. And I asked my dad, do you know anything about this? And do you have any memories or know how you all avoided being targeted in that? And he doesn't. He was a baby, or not even born, or a toddler when all of that was happening. But what he does remember is that his parents told them always, as soon as they leave the house, you no longer speak Spanish. You only speak English. And so for him, he says that if he thinks about that, it is this way for them to attempt to assimilate and not stick out as much. And of course, his parents had accents. But it was this attempt to at least stay under the radar. And so they would only speak English when they were in public. They would not speak Spanish. And my dad remembers and has memories of, what that kind of felt like. And I can only assume it felt like your native language was something negative and something to be almost ashamed of, and to fear speaking it in public. And he has memories of being in school and accidentally saying something in Spanish, and nothing bad, but just like saying something in Spanish. And he was the only, as he remembers, he was the only brown kid in his class. And so nobody knowing what he just said, and everybody having a fear response because he spoke a language that they did not understand, and him being reprimanded and being sent to the principal's office and forced to stay there until the Spanish teacher from the school came back. And he was asked to repeat what he said in front of them, and they realized, it was a completely innocent little phrase that he said that was nothing negative or an attack. He was just communicating. And then was sent back to his class as if nothing had happened, as if everything was okay. But that still sits with my dad. He still remembers that happening. And he can still tell me that story today. And so obviously that's a formative memory. That's something that has impacted him for the rest of his life. So I can only imagine kind of subconsciously how that impacts a child, and that is carried with them through their life of, I'm not really supposed to speak this language or else I'll get in trouble. Which kind of presents in different ways later on in life, in my life, and I may touch on that in a bit here. But yeah, so getting back to my grandparents. They are both working. My grandmother actually works in the meat and chicken processing facility. This is not a job that like any U.S. citizen ever wants, and this is something that we find to be very common that immigrants from other countries end up doing, and an industry that they end up working in. So she does this for a while. He's still working for the Southern Pacific Railroad, and eventually the Southern Pacific Railroad, I think, like closes, or the business shifts. His job is no longer relevant because of the advancement of technology in trains and how they operate. And so what ends up happening in the late 1950s, about 10 years after he first moved to the United States, he starts working for Greyhound instead, and his work for Southern Pacific Railroad ends. So he starts working for Greyhound, and he is like a maintenance man, mechanic, repairs, all of that for Greyhound. And then in the 60s, in 1969, they move from Central California further north to San Jose. I'm not quite sure if that was like a work transfer, or if they just wanted to move there, or what exactly what that was. But he was still working for Greyhound this whole time, and working for them while in San Jose. And at that point, they actually owned their home in the Central Coast. And so they started renting that out. And it's very funny. My dad even still remembers the woman who they started renting that out to. And they move to San Jose. They buy this fourplex. And they live in one of the units and then rent out the other 3 units. And this is how they establish themselves in San Jose. And something that my father remembers is that his parents were always looking in both places for white neighborhoods. They were not looking to stay in neighborhoods or communities that were mostly Mexican or other immigrant populations. And I can only kind of assume that this is another attempt to assimilate, to find safety amongst whiteness, and to find safety in separating yourselves from a larger crowd of immigrants. So this is what they did in San Jose. They lived in a white neighborhood, and this is what they looked for. Eventually, let me see here, in 1971, so just a couple of years after they moved to San Jose, they actually bought their own single-family home. So they moved out of the fourplex, sold the fourplex, apparently also sold the home that they owned in the Central Coast, and bought this house, single-family home in San Jose. All of this so far is kind of like, wow, checking off all the boxes of the things to do to achieve the quote-unquote American dream. And I don't really believe in the American dream, but this is the best way that I can kind of sum up what my grandparents did in the United States and how they were able to establish themselves here and build a life, create a foundation for future generations, for their children. And so, and San Jose back then was not what it is today at all. You know, my father remembers there just being orange orchards everywhere and farmland everywhere. It was not built up at all in the way it is today, especially in the all of the towns and cities now between San Jose and San Francisco. That was all agriculture land back then. So they established themselves in San Jose. My grandfather is still working for Greyhound, and I think what's really important to know here is that he worked for the Southern Pacific Railroad Company, and he worked for Greyhound at a time where both of those companies gave pensions to their employees. So my grandfather had 2 pensions by the time he retired. We all know in the United States that does not exist anymore at all. Nobody's getting a pension from any company. So the fact that this Mexican immigrant, has 2 pensions from 2 companies in the United States and had 2 careers with these companies. It provided a level of stability and security, not just for himself and my grandmother, but for his children and for future generations. And again, I can't really explain this other than luck and having met the right people at the right time and being in the right places at the right time and buying homes in the right places at the right time, right? That home in San Jose, my dad was telling me that they bought it for about $50,000, $50,000 in 1971. My family lived there. My grandfather lived there until he died in 2017, at the end of 2017. I also want to say here, a lot of what I'm sharing is not just told through the perspective of my dad, but really referring specifically to my grandfather versus my grandmother. And the reason for that is because I never really got to have any conversations with my grandmother. She had unfortunately she had fallen and had an accident before I was born and had a traumatic brain injury that made her handicapped for the rest of her life. And she was not verbal. She would be able to say maybe a couple of words here and there, but we couldn't never have a conversation. And so I never got to develop a real relationship with her. So any of the questions I did have the opportunity to ask when my grandparents were alive were to my grandfather. Any of these conversations about them coming to the United States, those conversations were with my grandfather and my dad. And my grandmother also passed away when I was younger. Also just like a different frame of mind of the things that I'm thinking about and the conversations I think are important to have. But even then, when I did start asking these questions of my grandfather, I wish I had asked them sooner, because I didn't really start having these conversations with him until about a week before he died. And so I ask everybody who still has grandparents who are alive, please have conversations with them. Ask them questions, especially if they came to the United States or to the city where they live or where you grew up from somewhere else. Get curious with them. Ask them why they did it. Ask them what it was like for them. Ask them what their thoughts were, what their struggles were, what was easier for them. I really wish I could have had that forethought to ask those types of questions of my grandpa while he was alive and get a little bit more of his own personal thoughts versus just like the facts of when did you come here? How did you get here? What did you do when you first got here? All of that stuff. Yeah, I wish I kind of had the thought to ask some more of those personal questions of what his own ideas and thought process was for everything he was experiencing. So 1971, they buy their home. Kids all grow up. They do their thing. My grandmother actually was a very curious person as well, as how she's been described to me. She was very smart. She was very interested in learning about things. And so at some point while they were all living in San Jose, she actually started going to night school and taking classes on electronics and learning how to work on electronics. Don't know the details, but eventually she got a job with Memorex and was building computer chips for them. So a smart woman also had her own job and kept busy, raised the whole family, had a job, had all of her interests with sewing and knitting and the beadwork and all of these things that she did. And yeah, was also her whole own human. So, my grandparents did all of this work. They established these lives here. They established their family here. And their kids go to school. They graduate. My dad ends up graduating from UCLA with a degree in film. And he becomes a television director. And he's in the television industry at a time where bilingual television is becoming a thing. It's becoming in demand. It's becoming kind of quote unquote popular, and he realizes, which is an interesting tie back to language and his experiences as a child, that his ability to speak Spanish is actually a huge asset to him. So he ends up having all of these opportunities to work in Spanish language television and English language television. He directs television shows. He directs a novela in Spanish. He directs game shows in Spanish and English. He ends up directing like a local kind of news thing in English in Southern California. And like, what power to find in your native language. And I would hope maybe this relearning that being able to speak Spanish is a huge asset and is quite beneficial in the world. Being able to speak multiple languages in general is a really powerful thing to be able to do. And so this all comes back to, not just my grandfather taking this huge risk, but my great-grandmother encouraging him to take this huge risk and do the thing because she was supportive of him doing this. And he listened to her instead of listening to his dad, who was not supportive of him going elsewhere, building a life elsewhere, and leaving the ranch. And going back to the language piece, I have asked my parents, because I grew up as a no sabo kid, which basically means I was not taught Spanish, and so I did not speak Spanish as a child. My parents did not teach me the language. I knew a few phrases. There were some things that we said in the family, whether it was like when I was in trouble or just phrases I learned. I think it was one of the first trips that we took to Mexico as a family. I remember learning some phrases of like how to ask, ¿Dónde está el baño? I want to order this. I want to order that for food. Or like, how do I get over here? So learning certain phrases and questions, but not ever being taught Spanish in a way where I could actually speak it. And I've asked my parents why they didn't teach me Spanish. And I think for both of them, it stems from this, again, this thing that they learned as children, that speaking Spanish isn't good. You don't do that outside of the house. You will get in trouble if you speak Spanish outside. And I think that trauma stays with people. And this is how it reflects through them later in life, is they don't teach their children their own native language. I had to go, here's a little add-on story here. I do speak Spanish today. Not super, super conversationally, but I'm comfortable enough to get by. But I learned my Spanish by going to Spain. And I spent some time living in Spain in a small town where nobody spoke English, and I was forced to learn Spanish. And that's what I wanted. That's why I went to Spain, is because I wanted to better my Spanish. So I go there, I spend some time there. I remember being back in the United States. I had only been back for maybe a week. I was on the phone with my grandfather, and I was in the car with my mom. We're driving. This is in Los Angeles. We're driving. I'm on the phone with my grandpa. we're having this phone call, and we're speaking entirely in Spanish. I remember hanging up and my mom turning to me and being like, "Holy shit, you sound like such a Spaniard." And I just said back to her, "Well, I had to go to Spain to learn Spanish, so that's the accent that I learned. That's the accent I was just around full time for however many months." And like, yeah, that's going to rub off on me. And I've had similar interactions with my dad too. It's like, I mean, I had to go all the way to Spain to learn Spanish. You didn't teach me this language. And I no longer speak with a Spanish accent. I have learned to turn that off. But it's interesting. Like, this is what I had to do. Well, what I felt I had to do to learn Spanish. And I think, that's it. There is a connection to shame around language, around Spanish specifically, and being different and feeling like you are different and being othered by the people around you because you have to speak a different language. And I think there is a shift of perspective in that, where it's like, man, we are re-embracing the fact that we are bilingual or trilingual, because there's so much power in that. Like I said, that is something that became a huge asset for my dad in his career. He has not been in the television industry for 20 years, maybe a little bit longer. But that's something that really helped him along the way. Like I said earlier, there's so many pieces to this part of my family's story that I feel like are rooted in luck and having the right opportunities presented to them at the right time. And a question that I'm sitting with, and a question that I feel like I'm going to be posing to most people who are participating in this first season, is, if this happened today, if my grandfather had taken this risk today and come to the United States, if the circumstances were presented, would he still be able to do what he did back then, today? Would he still have been able to build the life he did? Would he still have been able to become a US citizen? And the honest answer is no. There is no pathway today. It doesn't exist. And I think this is one of the things that people in the United States don't understand, is there is no pathway to citizenship anymore unless you have the money to buy it. It is a business. And so my answer to that question, would it have been possible today? Hell no. He couldn't have done it today. Which comes back to the realization that he did the right thing at the right time because he was in the right place and had the right opportunities presented to himself. And yeah, it's pretty discouraging. There's almost this feeling of guilt of like, why was this so readily available to my family, but not others? Not others today. And there's so much there in just, the politicization of migration, the militarization of our borders. And that's a whole other topic that I'm not going to touch on today. But these are the things that I think about. And these are the things that are impacting our lives. And so many of the people who are here in the United States as citizens today are here because of the timing, and are citizens because of their timing. And it's not just the Mexicans. It is the white people. It is the Asian community. So many of the folks who have had the opportunities that they have had access to those because of timing. And it's really unfortunate that that's not available to people today. That is kind of the gist of my family's migration story on my dad's side to the United States. We're going to hear from some other people this season. Some of them have similar threads in their stories. Some of them are very different. And I hope that we can all just learn a little bit more about each other. And my goal is to leave you thinking and asking questions, and with the realization that the current state of this nation is completely built off of people who migrated here. And unless you are native, indigenous to this place, like, you came from somewhere else. And even then, when we're looking even further back, like I said from the beginning, like, migration is one of the most human things that we have done since the beginning of our existence on this planet. I look forward to having these conversations with other people. I look forward to sharing these conversations with you. And for now, I'm going to close this episode out. And that is the story of how my grandparents came to the United States. So, thank you for listening, and thank you for joining. My name is Madeleine Longoria Garcia, and these are our other stories. You can listen to this podcast on Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Podcasts, and look out for some other ways to connect with us and build community soon. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.